Hey everyone. Wait, is this thing on? Alright, it's on. What up? This is a piece from the uh, new book, Marx Key Concepts, edited by Riccardo Bellofiore and Tommaso Redolfi Riva, I think is the name. I don't know, I don't look at the cover again. But this piece is by a person named Emanuela Conversano, and it's titled The Ethnological Notebooks. And I'm assuming is about Marx's ethnological notebooks. Almost 50 years after Lawrence Crader, Krader, it says that Lawrence Crader was an American socialist anthropologist and ethnologist. So back to the text. Almost 50 years after Lawrence Crader edited the Ethnological Notebooks of Karl Marx, which spanned from 1880 to 1882, the book was published in 1972, we can definitely state that the research about Marx and the Marxisms has certainly benefited, opening up to topics better suited to a globalized world, in which the critique of the capitalist mode of production cannot be separated from the struggles, quote, at the margins, end quote, of the capitalistic world. Footnote. I am referring to the title of Kevin B. Anderson's book of 2016 that is now a landmark in the discussion of the topics mentioned in the book's subtitle, that is, nationalism, ethnicity, and non-Western societies, which could be erroneously taken as minor issues in Marx's thought, end footnote. Whether these struggles be understood as the claims of subaltern groups such as women or ethnic minorities, or of Western peoples outside the geographical borders of the capitalistic center. Additionally, Crader's edition has encouraged many non-Marxist scholars to explore the reasons for and the goals of Marx's unfinished investigation on non-capitalist societies and the conditions of their historical development, and also to consider it as a new chance for political theory and praxis. A chance that would have been missed if Marx's late investigation in the fields of ancient and colonial history, anthropology, and ethnology were just reduced to an attempt to, quote, present the results of Morgan's researches, end quote, comparing, quote, barbarism and civilization, end quote, in connection with the conclusions of the materialistic conception of history, end quote, as Engels puts it in his 1884 preface to the first edition of The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State. Marx's companion is referring to the investigation on the history of the family and the systems of consanguinity, which is that family? Consanguinity, the fact of being descended from the same ancestor. It says, consanguinity, blood relationship, or from Latin for blood relationship, is the characteristic of having a kinship with a relative who is descended from a common ancestor. Many jurisdictions have laws prohibiting people who are related by blood from marrying or having sexual relations with each other. The degree of consanguinity that gives rise to this prohibition varies from place to place. Such rules are also used to determine heirs of an estate according to statutes that govern intestate succession, which also vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. In some places and time periods, cousin marriage is allowed or even encouraged. In others, it is taboo and considered to be incest. The degree of relative consanguinity can be illustrated with a consanguinity table in which each level of lineal consanguinity, generation, or meiosis, meiosis, appears as a row, and individuals with a collaterally consanguineous relationship, I don't know if I'm saying that right, share the same row. The knot system is a numerical notation that describes consanguinity using the N-tafel numbers of shared ancestors. There's a little more than I need to know, but that's okay. Back to the text. Marx's companion is referring to the investigation on the history of the family and the system of consanguinity undertaken in the 1870s by one of the fathers of Victorian anthropology, Lewis Henry Morgan, whose essay, Ancient Society, of 1877, Marx had read, noted down, and commented a few years after its publication. Engels summarizes allegedly, quote, Morganian, end quote, Morganian, end quote, conclusions of Marx's notes in terms of a theory that basically splits history in two, precisely presenting a prehistory as its point of departure, during which the ties of blood and kin, Geschlechtsbande, had been dominating the social order, to be then replaced by the, quote, written history, end quote, of productivity of labor, which, quote, develops more and more, and with it private property and exchange, differences in wealth, the possibility of utilizing the labor power of others, and thereby the basis of class antagonisms, end quote. The transition from the old to the new society should be explained according to the materialist conception that Engels holds to have been discovered by Marx and to share with him, quote, within certain limits, end quote. In the same preface of his essay, which he defines as a, quote, fulfillment of a behest, end quote, Engels recognizes as, quote, determining factor in history, in the final instance, the production and reproduction of the immediate life, end quote, in its twofold character. On the one hand, quote, the production of the means of subsistence, ... on the other, the production of human beings themselves, end quote. Engels. Although the development of both aspects contributes to determining the social organization of a certain historical period, the more the productivity of labor grows within the sex-based society, the less the blood ties count as the decisive trigger of history, and history properly begins as a class struggle. See Engels, 1884. Furthermore, Lewis Henry Morgan does not merely reconstruct the origin of what Lewis Henry Morgan calls, quote, civilization, end quote. But Lewis Henry Morgan also assumes that the law of progress applies to the future as it has to the past. Hence, Lewis Henry Morgan foreshadows a third phase. This is a quote, higher plane of society, end quote, that will be the, quote, revival in a higher form of the liberty, equality, and fraternity of the ancient gents, end quote. Morgan, 1877, also quoted in Engels, 1884. In Engels' opinion, Morgan's words about the, quote, future transformation of society, end quote, might have been used by Marx himself to close the picture of the dialectic development that would lead from the prehistory of capital to communist society. Those are indeed Marx's written words, insofar as Marx recorded the passage of Morgan's Ancient Society in his notebooks. And Marx even envisaged the same outcome in the famous drafts of the letter to the Russian revolutionary Feresasulych, with which Marx wanted to answer her question about the destiny of the Russian commune, the Obstchina, in the early 1880s. See Marx 1881. Footnote. See in particular the first draft. End footnote. What exactly is the meaning of those words for Marx himself? On the one hand, in the first draft of the letter, Marx explicitly refers to, quote, the American writer, end quote, who undoubtedly deserves credit for his acknowledgement that, quote, a mere property career is not the final destiny of mankind, end quote. Morgan 1877, quoted in Marx 1880-82, and Engels 1884. On the other hand, in another paragraph of the drafts, Marx complains about the inadequacy of the historiography on ancient communities, which is limited to, quote, very rough sketches, end quote. Marx, 1881. Certainly, Marx also has in mind the historical attempts of other representatives of the bourgeois historical sciences. In fact, the most trivial reason for distinguishing the positions of Marx and Engels is that Marx had not been focusing only on Morgan's research in the last years of his life, unlike Engels in his book on the origin of the family, but in a wide variety of themes and texts, often reading them almost hot off the press. It is worth naming first of all the notes on some looks like it's in Russian. I can't pronounce this, but it says it translates as the communal possession of land, causes, course, and consequences of its decline, a work of 1879 by Maxim Kovalevsky, published in 1879. A Russian sociologist and promulgator of the positivistic historical comparative method in Russia that Marx read in the same year, and where the title of Morgan's book is mentioned. Look up Maxim Kovalevsky. Maxim Kovalevsky, who lived from 1851 to 1916, was a jurist and main authority on sociology in the Russian Empire. Maxim Kovalevsky was vice president in 1895 and president 1905 of the International Institute of Sociology. Maxim Kovalevsky also held a chair in sociology at the Psychoneurological Institute. Maxim Kovalevsky was elected into the Russian Academy of Sciences in 1914. The Russian Sociological Society adopted Maxim Kovalevsky's name in 1916. Back to the text. Marx's notebook on Kovalevsky is partially accessible to English-speaking readers thanks to Lawrence Crater, who translated Marx's notebook on Kovalevsky as an appendix of his essay on the Asiatic mode of production. Crater, 1975. A few years after collecting the other ethnological notebooks on the so-called Victorian or evolutionist anthropologists, often involved in the British government, either in the mother country or in the colonies. That is, the book of Sir John Budd Fear. No, where'd it go? God, I accidentally closed out. The book of Sir John Budd Fear. John Budd Fear. Says that Sir John Budd Fear who lived from 1825 to 1905, was a judge and author who was the 13th Chief Justice of Ceylon. John Bud Fear was appointed on the 18th of October 1877, succeeding William Hackett, and was Chief Justice until 1879. Sir John Bud Fear was succeeded by Richard Cayley. When Fear retired, Harry Dias Bandarnaki acted as Chief Justice for 12 days. Sir John Bud Fear was the oldest of three sons of John Fear, rector of Earl Stonham. One of his brothers, Samuel George Fear, became master of Emanuela College, Cambridge. John Bud Fear also stood as the Liberal parliamentary candidate for Honiton in the reformed 1885 borough elections, but ultimately lost to Sir John Kennaway, Conservative candidate, and never stood for the seat again. So that's who Bud Fear is. I gotta look some things up here, sorry. Okay. And, sorry. Sir Henry Sumner Maine is another name that's mentioned here. Harry Sumner Maine, who lived from 1822 to 1888, was a British Whig, comparative jurist, and historian. Henry Maine is famous for the thesis outlined in his book, Ancient Law, that law and society developed, quote, from status to contract, end quote. According to the thesis, in the ancient world, individuals were tightly bound by status, dealing with in a particular group, while in the modern one, in which individuals are viewed as autonomous agents, they are free to make contracts and form associations with whomever they choose. Because of this thesis, Maine can be seen as one of the forefathers of modern legal anthropology, legal history, and sociology of law. It says his book was titled The Origin of Civilization. I don't know. Okay, that's him. Oh no. I don't know. Sir John Lubbock. John Lubbock, 1st Baron Avebury. Lived from 1884 to 1913, known as Sir John Lubbock. 4th Baronet from 1865 until 1900. Was an English banker, liberal politician, philanthropist, scientist, and polymath. John Lubbock worked in his family company as a banker, but made significant contributions in archaeology, ethnography, and several branches of biology. John Lubbock coined the terms, quote, Paleolithic, end quote, Neolithic, end quote, to denote the Old and New Stone Ages, respectively. John Lubbock helped establish archaeology as a scientific discipline and was influential in debates concerning evolutionary theory. John Lubbock introduced the first law for the protection of UK's archaeological and architectural heritage. John Lubbock was a founding member of the X Club. Alright, so let me get back to the text, now that I have these references laid out. A few years after collecting other ethnological notebooks on the so-called Victorian or evolutionist anthropologists often involved in the British government, either in the mother country or in the colonies, that is, the book by Sir John Bud Fear, The Aryan Village in India and Ceylon, of 1880, the Lectures on the Early History of Institutions of 1875 by Sir Henry Sumner Maine, The Origins of Civilization and the Primitive Condition of Man, published in 1870 by Sir John Lubbock, but many other notebooks are still unpublished. Footnote. See, among others, the notes on L. Lang, Römische Altertümer, 1856, collected in the same notebook, including Kovalevsky's work, and analyzed by H. Brown in 2012, or the notes from J.W.B. Money, Java or How to Manage a Colony, published in 1861, in the same notebook of the so-called ethnological ones. These Marxian notes will presumably be part of the digital volumes of the Mega Abteilung 4, volume 24, 27, 28, 29, but some translations have already been published in recent years based on the Crater and Harstick editions. See also the partial French translation in a volume collecting many essays on the late Marx, Lindner, 2019, and Italian translations of the Crater edition by A. Bracaletti, M. Singoli, G. Sgro, F. Vidoni, which substitutes and corrects the partial and somewhat deceptive translation by P. Foraboschi. All the original papers by Marx and Engels have been digitized by the Amsterdam-based International Institute of Social History. End footnote. I am quite persuaded that Marx's remark in the letter's draft is at least a clue to discuss Engels' interpretation of a complete appropriation of Morgan's discoveries by the late Marx. Since I maintain that the above-mentioned inquiries are neither a mere fulfillment of the 1840s historical materialism, as sketched in the Origins, nor a sudden anthropological turn in the name of Morgan, I also assume the importance of going beyond those, quote, certain limits, end quote, within which the positions of Engels, Marx, and Morgan can converge, in order to understand what the actual, quote, legacy, end quote, Vermachtnis of late Marx's so-called ethnological studies as a whole can be in the contemporary world. Trying to distinguish Engels' effort to put Marx's late inquiry on the non-Western world from Marx's notes per se does not mean to make the former the scapegoat for all the following misleading interpretations of Marx's theory of society and history. Rather, it means to create the conditions to consider all the topics involved in the latter's point of view, to comprehend the spirit of his intellectual and practical activity, and to recognize its potentials both in the current theoretical activity and in today's political claims and struggles. It is a way to grasp the very meaning of Marxian, quote, anthropological, end quote, interest, broader than and different from a simple historical reconstruction in terms of passage from barbarism to civilization, but, on the contrary, consistent with some key concepts of the contemporary humanities, for instance, the triad of race, class, and gender, which appear to reduce the gap between fields such as gender studies and feminisms, post-colonial and subaltern studies on the one hand, and Marxism on the other. Footnote. However, it should not be forgotten that there have also been attempts to detect elements of a theory of intersectionality in Engels' interpretation. See, for example, the reappraisal of the origin made by Lisa Vogel in connection with the new wave of feminism. See Vogel, 1996. End footnote. Thus, late Marx's research raises the question of whether we can call ourselves Marxists today if even Marx himself claimed he was not, or at least this is what Engels relates after Marx's death, in a letter in which he tries to differentiate their, quote, historical materialism, end quote, from the, quote, cliches, end quote, using the expression, quote, to run up a jerry-built system out of their own relatively inadequate historical knowledge, end quote. Engels, 1890. Footnote. Marx's assessment should have been addressed to the French Marxists. Besides Engels' letter of the 5th of August 1890 to Conrad Schmidt, see also Engels 1890. End footnote. But since we know that Marx instead never employed that expression, historical materialism, I'm assuming that's the expression they're referring to, it is worth asking what is Marx's Marxism, and what use the late Marx made of the historical knowledge, if we learn from his 1850s foundation of political economy that the goal of his system was neither to, quote, write the real history of the production relations, end quote, nor to consider the capitalist relations to be, quote, eternal and natural, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. Marx's historical analysis is part of his method of inquiry. Marx's historical analysis is part of his method of inquiry. Forschungsweise. That, quote, has to appropriate the material in detail, to analyze the material's different forms of development, to trace out the material's interconnection, end quote, as he explained in the 1873 afterword to the second German edition of Capital, Volume 1. Marx's ethnological notebooks give us access to Marx's laboratory, where Marx is far from formulating a complete theory of, quote, non-capitalist, end quote, systems, but Marx is dealing with modes of production in which different relationships have been ruling in comparison to those between capital and wage labor in Western Europe. At least before the capital domination penetrated those modes of economic production and social reproduction, through either a solely economic or real systematic colonization, as Marx immediately noticed while articulating his theory of capital itself. Footnote. See the last chapters of the first volume of Capital related to the, quote, so-called primitive accumulation, end quote, and the, quote, theory of colonization, end quote. End footnote. At the same time, Marx is also involved in a lower level of abstraction compared to the exposition, Darstellung, of the critique of political economy, focusing on the logic of the capitalist system. There, Marx is not looking to ancient societies to find categories in the past that can immediately be applied to the future, but he is still reasoning about how specific categories, historically arisen from given circumstances, mutually relate in the modern bourgeois society, and how those specific relations of production contradict each other to such an extent that they lead to their dissolution. Footnote. See Marx, Grundrisse. End footnote. As Moïse Pastone points out, the form of presentation of Marx's mature critical theory could not contradict the, quote, historically determined character of the analysis, end quote, proceeding from a supposedly, quote, transhistorically valid, end quote, starting point. Footnote. See Marx's critique of the general point of view of a, quote, historico-philosophical theory whose supreme virtue consists in being superhistorical, end quote, in his 1877 letter to the editor of the Otechestvenia Zabiskie. End footnote. Rather, the starting point, quote, had to express the historical specificity of its object and consequently of the theory itself, end quote. Therefore, Stefano Breda is right to emphasize the, quote, limits of Marxist materialist dialectics, which deals with the quote, peculiar development of a peculiar object, end quote. That is, the capitalist mode of production, not in an empirical but in an analytical way. Nonetheless, apart from its theoretical exposition, it makes use of historical empirical presuppositions to establish the mutual implications between the categories within the peculiar capitalist relationships. See Breda 2018. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm just looking up seeing if Stefano Breda. Seems like Stefano Breda is written on, Marxist dialectics and shit like that. I'm not really seeing like a biography that I can read aloud though. Just see some of the pieces. Breda's definition of the Marxian dialectics in terms of an immanent critique of the empirical immediacy, insofar as it denies how the relationships manifest themselves objectively in the experience by, quote, showing another content placed empirically as its condition of existence, end quote. Breda 2018. Footnote. My translation, end footnote. Contributes to explain as Marx defines it in the 1873 afterword to Capital, quote, it is, in its rational form, it is a scandal and abomination for bourgeoisdom and its doctrinaire professors, because it includes in its comprehension and affirmation, and affirmative recognition of the existing state of things, at the same time also the recognition of the negation of that state, of its inevitable breaking up, because it regards every historically developed social form as in fluid movement, and therefore it takes into account its transient nature, not less than its momentary existence, because it lets nothing impose upon it, and is in its essence critical and revolutionary, end quote. Marx. In my opinion, the so-called forms which precede capitalist production are, which is like a book, or it's in italics, in capital letters, at least, are a clear example of this attitude. Since this text has not to be understood as a historiographic excursus that aims to, quote, put them all on the same plane, end quote, Marx 1881, the picture resulting from the sections of the 1857-58 Grundrisse dedicated to non-capitalist forms of production may to some extent fit with the scheme depicted in the introduction to Engels' Origin, since Marx describes, quote, kinship tribes, end quote, as historically preceding, quote, locality tribes, end quote. Marx 1857-58, Grundrisse, and corresponding to a limited, quote, development of the productive forces, end quote, that brings in itself to the dissolution of the community-based social form that had become too, quote, narrow for the unfolding of the progressive human pack, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. The, quote, preservation, end quote, which is the object of all the pre-capitalist communities, necessarily entails the, quote, destruction, end quote, of the communities themselves, since, quote, in the act of reproduction itself are changed not only the objective conditions, e.g., villages become city, the wilderness becomes cultivated clearings, etc., but also the producers, who transform themselves in that the producers evolve new qualities from within themselves, develop through production new powers and new ideas, new modes of intercourse, new needs, and new speech, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. Marx's scheme of the transition from one socioeconomic form to another does not aim at dividing history into chronological periods or historico-philosophical stages. Footnote. See Gianni Sofri in his book on the Asiatic mode of production, published in 1969, but also another milestone in the Marxian literature, the almost contemporary essay by Alfred Schmidt of 1962 on Marx's concept of nature. In the appendix on the relation between history and nature in dialectical materialism, Alfred Schmidt underlines the non-evolutionist character of Marxian account of historical development and the qualitative rupture represented by the emergence of bourgeois society as a result of objective conditions, quote, created by the participants in history, end quote. This interpretation rightly denies that Marx's theory reads history, quote, in accordance with uniform interpretive capital I idea, end quote. Also, by separating the positions of Marx and Engels, as Alfred Schmidt makes clear through the whole essay. See in particular his critique of Engels' dialectics of nature. End footnote. It is instead coherent with the method of the critique of political economy that in order to present the laws of the bourgeois economy as a, quote, mere historical form of production, end quote, runs up in the, quote, process preceding the formation of the capitalist relationship, end quote. Nonetheless, the fact that in, quote, broad outline, the Asiatic, ancient, feudal, and modern bourgeois modes of production may be designed as epochs marking progress in the economic development of society, end quote. Marx, 1859. Does not mean either that what happened in the past of the capitalistic formation should necessarily apply to the future, or that it has been so everywhere and in every circumstance. None of these key points is acquired by Marx after discovering Morgan's research, since not only in the 1875 French edition of Capital does Marx explicitly delimit the validity of the process that leads towards capitalist production to the countries of Western Europe, as broadly acknowledged by most of the scholars. But already in a fragment from the early 1850s, he had distinguished two possible ways of the, quote, real history, end quote. The decline of the feudal system, slavery, and serfdom as in the West, and the decay of the communal property as in the Orient and among Slav people. Footnote. Just some shit in French. I'm not about to read that. And no, there's nothing there for me to read. No. It's all just foreign languages that I won't understand and you don't want to hear. Nor is it legitimate to claim that Marx gives Morgan credit for having conceived, independently of himself, of historical development in a multilinear way. To some extent, for both Marx and Morgan, the comprehension of the pre-capitalist societies acts as a sort of litmus test to grasp the dynamics of the capitalist society and the capitalist society's future outcomes. Furthermore, Marx has the merit of acknowledging the historic character of the bourgeois institutions of family, property, and state. In particular, through the analysis of the tribal organization of the Native American gens of the Iroquois in comparison with the ancient Greeks and Roman gentes. However, we know that for Marx it is not enough to trace a historical account to prevent this account from being transhistorical. Therefore, what we need to understand is how the historical development of those institutions, as outlined by Lewis Henry Morgan, relate to the logic outlined by the Marxian historical and materialist dialectics, and not to a supposed historical materialism. The precondition of Marxian dialectic understanding of reality is the critique of the essentialism and naturalization of historically specific social production. That is the famous critique of the quote, Robinsonades and quote, of classical economists, to use the language of the Grundrisse, or of the quote, judicial blindness, end quote, or what we call quote humanities, end quote, to which Marx refers in a letter to Engels in 1868. Footnote. See Marx's letter to Engels on the 25th of March, 1868. Quote, human history is like paleontology. Jesus Christ, I'm just keep fucking up. Owing to a certain judicial blindness, even the best intelligences absolutely fail to see the things which lie in front of their noses. Later, when the moment has arrived, we are surprised to find traces everywhere of what we failed to see. The first reaction against the French Revolution and the period of enlightenment bound up with it was naturally to see everything as medieval and romantic. Even people like Grimm are not free from this. The second reaction is to look beyond the Middle Ages into the primitive age of each nation, and that corresponds to the socialist tendency. Although these learned men have no idea that the two have any connection, they are therefore surprised to find what is newest and what is oldest, and even egalitarians to a degree, which would have made Proudhon shudder, end quote. Marx, 1868. End footnote. Marx's criticism turns to a series of different but symmetrical errors by, quote, those who have an interest in remaining blind, end quote. Footnote. So wrote Marx in the second draft of the letter to Farasasulich. End footnote. Such an interest aims to justify the capitalist mode of production, to represent the capitalist mode of production as natural and eternal, and as the model for all societies. The ideological nature and the practical consequences of these theoretical weaknesses have been unmasked throughout Marxian ethnological research. Through his omissions, comments, and glosses throughout his notebooks on the Victorian anthropologists, Marx seems to carry out what I have elsewhere defined as his implicit, quote, critique of anthropology, end quote, in analogy with the, quote, critique of political economy, end quote, which Marx carried out as the foundation of his theory of capital. Footnote. Let me refer to a previous article of mine on this subject. See Conversano 2018. End footnote. Marx's notebooks are composed in a mix of languages, English above all, since Marx transcribes long passages from his Anglo-American sources, and in German, since he shortens some passages or adds some comments. By comparing Marx's excerpts with the original sources, it is not always easy to understand Marx's judgment on what he reads, although it appears that the longer the uncommented upon excerpts, the greater Marx's agreement. By contrast, the disagreement with the, quote, civilized asses that cannot free themselves of their own conventionalities, end quote, is much clearer. Footnote. Here Marx comments diese Zivilisierten Esel können ihrer eigenen Konventionalities nicht loswerden. I don't know what the hell that means, but yeah, that's what the footnote says. Anyway, end footnote. To this extent, Engels is not totally wrong in recognizing the privileged position of Morgan's research and Marx's attitude towards anthropology. Because the Morganian history of the family, or the Morganian history of the family, according to which the modern monogamian family is not the natural family formation, but the result of a long historical development which leads from classless and stateless communities based on kinship relations to state societies whose antagonisms are embodied in miniature by the family, is the immediate base through which Marx can criticize the ideological naturalization of the monogamian family and the modern society in the works of Maine, Fear, and Lubbock. All of them, quote, failed with the gens, end quote, Engels, 1884, because the, quote, colored glasses, end quote, Marx, 1880 to 82, with which they read the antiquity prevent them from recognizing it as the unity of organization of kinship descending from a common ancestor, which ruled the lineage and therefore the property relations. In this regard, Marx comments that Lubbock, quote, knows nothing of the base, i.e. the gens, end quote. Marx, 1880 to 82. That the, quote, block-headed Englishman, end quote, Maine misunderstands the pre-colonial Indian institutions because Maine holds the patriarchal family as the original cell, Marx. That the, quote, asinus, end quote, fear lets, quote, everything be founded by private families, end quote, Marx. Even the property relationships observed within the colonial communities in India. The, quote, colored glasses, end quote, worn by those scholars whom Marx designates under the name, quote, klassische Schülergelehrsamkeit, quote, so classical school erudition, end quote, which obstructs a full comprehension of other economies and social systems, are the glasses of the bourgeois ideology, which has to put its socioeconomic organization as the natural form of society, instead of recognizing it as a historical social relation of production, because of its interest in justifying the capitalist domination. At first glance, it is hard to imagine that Marx would have attached any of those Philistine attributes to Morgan, although a preliminary argument to be made to temper Engels' enthusiasm is that Marx had already made considerable advancement in his knowledge of the gens, which in the Grundrisse was still confused, by reading, before Morgan, at least the works of Kovalevsky and probably also the work on ancient Rome by Lange. Footnote. For a valuable assessment of Lange's unpublished excerpts, see Brown, 2012, and her essay in Lindner, 2019. Heather Brown predates Marx's notes on Lange over those on Morgan, although from the notes themselves and the epistolary is not easy to provide a precise datation to these extracts. End footnote. Nonetheless, if we consider, for instance, the following passage from the notebook on Morgan, we cannot but think that Marx was positively impressed. Quote, mit Besung auf die present monogamy in family, it must advance as society advances and change as society changes, even as it has done in the past. It is the creature of the social system, must be supposable that it is capable of still further improvement, until the equality of the sexes is attained. Should the monogamy in family in the distant future fail to answer the requirements of society, assuming the continuous progress of civilization, it is impossible to predict the nature of its successor. End quote. Marx. In addition to the appreciation, which we can only share, of Morgan's reference to gender equality, Marx might have positively interpreted the assumption about the impossibility of prophesizing the character of the next stage of the social development in anti-deterministic terms. If we consider the emphasis he was giving in the same years to the non-teleological meaning of his, quote, historical sketch of the genesis of capitalism in Western Europe, end quote, which should not be transformed in, quote, an historico-philosophic theory of the general course fatally imposed on all people, whatever the historic circumstances in which it finds itself, in order that it may ultimately arrive at the form of economy which will ensure, together with the greatest expansion of the productive powers of social labor, the most complete development of man. End quote. Marx. Footnote. It is the answer that Marx gives to the editor of the Russian journal Otechestvenaya Zabisky in 1877. He writes the letter in French discussing the meaning of the famous chapter on the, quote, so-called primitive accumulation, end quote, in the first book of Capital. Marx comes back to this point in the drafts of the letter to Ferenc Zasulich in 1881. The, quote, man, end quote, of the English translation is more properly the, quote, private producer, end quote, since Marx uses the French expression, quote, producteur individuel, end quote. End footnote. However, elsewhere in his essay, Morgan refers to a general, quote, plan of supreme intelligence, that's in capital letters, capital S supreme, capital I intelligence, end quote, that would carry humanity from barbarism to civilization, and Marx repeatedly omits any mention of such finalism. Compare, for instance, Morgan 1877 with Marx 1880 to 1882, end footnote. What seems clear to me, reading between the lines of Marx's notes, by matching them with its sources, is that Marx is not simply passively acquiring a new scientific point of view, but Marx is interpreting the empirical data which the ethnologists have usefully collected in the field, evaluating them in the light of his own scientific method, and carrying out his own critique. In the case of Morgan, due to his credit in the eyes of Marx, nonetheless, it is a sort of, quote, in negative, end quote, critique that can already be glimpsed from the way Marx rearranges the sequence of chapters in Ancient Society, the book Ancient Society by Morgan. By recording the chapter about the rise of the government in history after that on the family and the property, which instead follow in Morgan's account. Marx's adjustments certainly reflect his critique of the idealistic aspects of Morgan's work, a critique that is testified by Marx leaving out systematically the expression of, quote, idea of, end quote, which Morgan places before the concepts of family, property, and government when he explains that the modern civilization is the outcome of the development of those ideas during the human history from barbarism forward, according to, quote, general human intelligence, end quote. It appears that, in the eyes of Marx, Morgan merely juxtaposes the material progress of the means of subsistence, corresponding to the passage from a kinship-based to a property and state-based society, with a design ideally superimposed to all peoples, which is the end and the goal that all peoples in history are set to achieve sooner or later. On the contrary, Marx emphasizes the active primary role of the family relationship as a driving force inside the society, unless that of being an essential part of the social relations and not a mere, quote, reflex of its culture, end quote. Footnote. Marx notes down a passage of Morgan's books referring to the advancement of the family and society as follows. Quote, "It must advance as society advances and change as society changes, even as it has done in the past. It is the creature of the social system, must be supposable that it is capable of still further improvement until the equality of sexes is attained." End quote. Instead of Marx's ellipsis, Morgan wrote, quote, "It is the creature of the social system and will reflect the social system's culture." End quote. See Marx 1880 to 1882 and Morgan 1877. End footnote. Where the fuck did where, trying to find where the footnote was so I can find my place again. Okay. However, Marx is not simply, quote, "placing back on its feet," end quote, what stands on its head in Morgan's account, confining himself to accepting the materialistic side of Morgan's account. In other words, Marx is not merely turning the cause and effect relationship between the elements involved in the society upside down and assigning to the family relationships the priority over culture and giving rise to supposed, quote, "civilization," end quote. In order to explain what I mean, let me quote another passage of Marx's notebook on Morgan, in which Marx is dealing with Morgan's account of the relation between the development of the forms of family in history and the systems of consanguinity. That is, regarding how the kinship bonds are conceived across the epochs, from a sort of communism in the family relation during the primitive condition of mankind to the monogamian family in the modern Western society. The forms of the family develop more rapidly than the consanguinity relationships, and determine the change of the latter, which ultimately seem the fossil record of a previous stage of mankind. While excerpting a passage from Morgan's book on this point, he glosses as follows. Quote, "De family active principle steht nie still, passes von a lower form into a higher one. Systems of consanguinity sind dagegen passiv, recording the progress made by the family at long intervals apart, and only changing radically when the family has radically changed. Ebenso verhält es sich mit politischen, religiösen, juristischen, philosophischen Systemen überhaupt." End quote. It is clear that in those lines Marx found something similar to the notorious, quote, "structure-superstructure," end quote, correlation. Nevertheless, since the two terms as such are a hapax in Marx's production, they should be considered in the light of the whole of Marx's theory, or even only in connection with the previous quotations from the Grundrisse, and with regard to the development of sex relations in history. Along with this paragraph, they cannot be interpreted in a unidirectional and deterministic way, but they rather allude to the role that specific relations assume in a given society. Once the family relations have become a historical presupposition inside the social system and interact with the development of the relations of production. In order to think about historical development, it is thus necessary to take into account all the aspects contributing to social change, thus both social production and reproduction. These aspects are not essential, universal, and natural, but are social relationships in a given social context, which have a precise function in the economic structure. In the Grundrisse, Marx also wrote, quote, In every form of society, there is a particular branch of production which determines the position and importance of all the others, and the relations obtaining in this branch accordingly determine those in all other branches. It is the general light tinging all other colors and modifying them in their specific quality. It is a special ether determining the specific gravity of everything found in it. End quote. Marx, Grundrisse. But, as Moishe Pastone rightly clarifies in another paragraph of the essay that I've already quoted above, quote, the social relations that form the basis of capitalist society are very different from the explicit and qualitatively determined social relations, such as kinship relations or relations of direct personal domination that characterize non-capitalist societies. Although the latter type of social relations continue to exist in capitalism, what ultimately structures that society is a new underlying level of social relations constituted by labor. End quote. Pastone, 2019. Footnote. My translation. End footnote. When comparing the non-capitalist society with capitalist society, Marx has no intention of retracing the line of the human evolution, either as Morgan does by paralleling the Iroquois gens with the ancient gens, or as Engels does by schematizing the transition from primitive communities to the capitalist society. In this sense, we could say that even Morgan's judgment should be defined as, quote, blind, end quote, from Marx's point of view, because the Victorian anthropologist takes modern American society as the model of his historical framework. On the contrary, Marx detects the irreducible specificity of modern capitalist society in comparison to a whole range of past and present non-capitalist forms. On the other hand, going deeper into the analysis of single cases of non-capitalist societies, both in the past and at the borders of the capitalist world, he encounters the existence of different modernities starting from the comparison between the peculiar characters of the communities contemporary with capitalism, in contrast not only to capitalism itself but also to the ancient communities. In the section of Maine's excerpts on Ireland, in fact, we can read, quote, at this point, property in its modern form has been established, but the joint family has not wholly ceased to influence successions. Parenthesis, Kneiswegs ist dich. I don't know, it says DDCH. I don't fucking know what that is. Quote, property in its modern form, end quote, established. See Russian communes. Marx, 1880 to 82. Marx's comment that, quote, in no way, end quote, is the modern property established, at least in the way described by the colored eyes of bourgeois Maine, seemed to be not only a, quote, vertical projection, end quote, of the present capitalist relations to the Irish Middle Ages, but also a, quote, horizontal projection, end quote, of the classical form of the capitalist society worldwide. Footnote. The classification of these two types of perspective errors as an object of Marx's criticism in the ethnological notebooks is due to Arndt, 2011, page 99. End footnote. In my opinion, the remark is a clear reference to the fact that there is no unique model of society, and that in such supposed modernity there are different, quote, historical milieux, end quote, in which the production and reproduction of material life are conveyed by different relations than the capitalist relations. Footnote. See the reply to the editor of the Russian journal Otesestvenia Zabisky in 1877 and the drafts of the letters to Ferenc Sulich, where Marx broadly uses this expression. End footnote. The survival of the Obstchina, which is the Russian commune, at the time must appear to Marx to be living proof of his interpretation, although embodying, quote, a superior form of the archaic type of property, end quote. The communes in Russia were still alive, but facing the penetration of capitalism and the possibility to build an alternative to it without suffering the birth pangs. Footnote. Elsewhere in the draft, Marx also states that the word, quote, archaic, end quote, should not alarm. End footnote. The triadic progress depicted by Morgan thus cannot be understood as the same dialectical movement outlined in Marx's Capital, which would lead to the, quote, negation of the negation, end quote, of capitalist relations, because this movement is limited to the analysis, that is, to the logic of capital's development, and it does not concern universal history, and second, since the progress of the capitalistic laws can be practically questioned by the actual encounter of other historical environments contemporary to capital, as Marx makes explicit in the drafts to his letters to Vera Sasulich. In the first one, Marx states, quote, while the commune is being bled and tortured, the commune's land sterilized and impoverished, the literary flunkies of the, quote, new pillars of society, end quote, ironically refer to the evils heaped on the commune as if they were symptoms of spontaneous, indisputable decay, arguing that it is dying a natural death and that it would be an act of kindness to shorten its agony. At this level, it is a question no longer of a problem to be solved, but simply of an enemy to be beaten. Thus, it is no longer a theoretical problem, it is a question to be solved. Sorry, it repeats itself. Thus, it is no longer a theoretical problem, it is a question to be solved, it is quite simply an enemy to be beaten. To save the Russian commune, there must be a Russian revolution, end quote. Marx, 1881. Such statements in the context of Marx's confrontation with the extra-European societies and revolutionary movements, the Russian in particular, have led Karl Heinzroth to argue that, in Marx's late analysis, the critique of political economy lags behind the revolutionary theory. If you're not familiar with Karl Heinzroth is like a German labor historian. I think that's what he does now. But Karl Heinzroth has his political history in autonomism, if you're familiar with like Italian like workerism and Italian autonomism in Italy. I think he was like affiliated with the journal, if you ever wrote endnotes or whatever. I think he's affiliated, I can't be 100% on this, but I think he's affiliated with the journal Wildcat Germany. On his German Wikipedia, it says that Karl Heinzroth is on the advisory board of the Internet Project Information on German Foreign Policy. He describes the group Wildcat, in whose magazine of the same name he publishes, as his political home. His political approach continues to be strongly influenced by operaism, Italian workerism. Yeah, so let me reread the sentence just to highlight Karl Heinzroth. Karl Heinzroth actually wrote the only thing I've actually read of Karl Heinzroth though is I can't remember what the actual piece is called. Is it called? He wrote a piece with a book by Marcel van der Linden, I think, called Beyond Marx, which is like, I think, discusses the role of unfree labor in capitalism. I'm not exactly sure. Just different types of labor than wage labor, I think, is what it's about. But he also wrote a book that's like a Forschung. I think it's called Towards a Global Labor History, which is a I don't even know what it's called, but it's like one of those books where it's like you know, dedicated to a living author and people like writing, uh, writing pieces that are kind of like relevant to their work in some capacity. But Karl-Heinz Roth wrote an extensive biography of uh, a pretty like extensive like biographical essay, intellectual biographical essay on Marcel van der Linden's life. If you don't know who Marcel van der Linden is, he was the president of like the International Institute of Social History in Amsterdam, and or was at one point for a long time, and then like I guess like the International Institute or like the International Society for Social History. But yeah, that's who Marcel Vandal is. And he wrote, and for my purposes on this channel, he wrote a huge, not huge, it's actually a very fairly compact book, dealing with a lot of information in it, called Western Marxism in the Soviet Union, which is a collection of essays, not essays, a collection, a like kind of like encyclopedic book of all the different uh, Marxist critiques of the Soviet social system. But that's not what this paper's about. But you should check any of that out. Sorry, my mind went wandering. Let me reread that last sentence. It's probably forgotten. Such statements in the context of Marx's confrontation with the extra-European societies and revolutionary movements, the Russian in particular, have led Karl-Heinz Roth to argue that, in Marx's late analysis, the critique of political economy lags behind the revolutionary theory. Roth 2021. See in particular paragraph 8 for Roth's very detailed and interesting contribution. Rather, I would say that it is the critique of political economy itself, as a critique of society that has to be reassessed in the light of structural changes in society, insofar as the objects of the critique are at the same time the subjects of the critique itself. Footnote. See the famous statement in the 1873 afterward to Capital I, where Marx suggests that it is the development of contradictions within the modern economic and social relations itself that is the foundation of the critique of political economy. Quote, since 1848, capitalist production is developed rapidly in Germany, and at the present time, capitalist production is in the full bloom of speculation and swindling, but fate is still unpropitious to our professional economists. At the time when they were able to deal with political economy in a straightforward fashion, modern economic conditions did not actually exist in Germany. And as soon as these conditions did come into existence, they did so under circumstances that no longer allowed of their being really and impartially investigated within the bounds of the bourgeois horizon. Insofar as political economy remains within that horizon, insofar that that is, as the capitalist regime is looked upon as the absolutely final form of social production, instead of as a passing historical phase of its evolution, political economy can remain a science only so long as the class struggle is latent or manifests itself only an isolated and sporadic phenomenon. End quote. Marx. It is also worth quoting Schmidt again, Alfred Schmidt, who, in order to explain in anti-unilinarist and anti-evolutionist terms Marx's famous statement on the anatomy of man being the key of the anatomy of the ape in the 1859 preface to A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, comments, quote, in itself, the historically higher stage is grounded in the lower, but the qualitative distinction between the lower form and the higher form, which has proceeded from it, can only be comprehended when the higher form is fully developed and has already become the object of an imminent critique. End quote. End footnote. In order to still call ourselves, quote, Marxist, end quote, then we should understand the, quote, specific gravity, end quote, we are immersed in and build a new dialectics that can be revolutionary today. I want to read. The essay is now over. I'm going to read the references now, to the degree that they are in English. They have an article by Kevin Anderson titled "The Unknown Marxist Capital, Volume 1." The French edition of 1872 to 75, 100 years later. That's from 1983 in the Review of Radical Political Economics. We also have Kevin B. Anderson's 2016. I don't know if it was when it was originally published. Marx at the Margins on Nationalism, Ethnicity, and Non-Western Societies. A book by an A. Arndt titled Marx Versuch über den Zusammenhang seiner Theorie. I'm not going to read all the ones in there's a book by Stefano Breda, a book by Heather Brown, Marx on Gender and the Family, a Critical Study, which I think is available through Haymarket now. It's part of the Historical Materialism book series. Engels' Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State. I'm not going to read all the Engels entries. A book by a Fora Boshi. A book by an H.P. Harstick. A book by Kovalevsky. Lawrence Crater's The Asiatic Mode of Production, Sources, Development, and Critique in the Writings of Karl Marx from 1975. K. Lindner. Les Derniers Marx. I don't know. A bunch of different letters that Marx wrote. Lewis Henry Morgan's 1877 Ancient Society, or Researches in the Lines of Human Progress from Savagery through Barbarism to Civilization, from 1877. Pistone, Capital and Temporality, which I think is in one of Marcel Mustou's books. It looks like this might be from a translation from a Marcelo Mustou book, the Marx Revival. Something by Lucia Pradella in German. Something by Karl Heinzroth in German. Alfred Schmidt, The Concept of Nature and Marx. G. Zoffrey and Lisa Vogel's, I think it's Lisa Vogel's 1996 Engels' Origin, Legacy, Burden, and Vision in C.J. Arthur's book Engels Today. All right, thanks for listening.